For millions of years, humans thrived as nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers. It was only around 10,000 years ago that a few societies around the world began to experiment with sedentism, agriculture, and the hoarding of resources. These societies spurred feedback loops of growth, inequality, and environmental devastation, conquering and colonizing and domesticating everyone and everything in their path, causing the sixth largest mass extinction in the history of life on Earth. Today, we live in a world that is a mismatch with our evolution in more ways than one. We feel disconnected, isolated, and powerless. Can we find our way back to a life that better matches how humans ought to live? What can we learn about how to live well from other cultures who had it figured out? Is there time to reverse our self destructive trajectory? How can we reclaim our wildness? These are the themes of the Rewilding Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding Podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewild workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. For millions of years, and in some places still today, hunter-gatherers raise competent and capable children. They do this while navigating challenging environments with predators, dangerous tools, and most notably, without any school. Contemporary societies have created learning environments that are a mismatch with the expectations of our genetic evolution. We weren't meant to sit in boxes all day. The system of compulsory education that spans the globe and shapes our perception of education was designed in the 1700s specifically to create dutiful factory workers for rising nationalism. They were not designed based on human evolution or human needs, but on the needs of capitalist entrepreneurs looking to increase obedience and efficient producers of wealth for them. So then, if not in schools, how are we best adapted to learn? What does learning look like in societies without schools? If hunter-gatherers represent the way of life most closely with which humans evolved in, what do they do to educate their children and prepare them for life as an adult? What can we learn about ourselves by studying these societies? To talk with me about this topic is Dr. Gul Deniz Salali. Dr. Salali is a PhD in evolutionary anthropology. Since 2013, she has been conducting anthropological fieldwork with the Bayaka hunter-gatherers in the Congo rainforest, studying their social learning, cooperative childcare practices, and the cultural evolution of their plant knowledge. Her research projects explore the learning of ecological knowledge, childhood and child care, and cultural evolution in hunter-gatherer communities. Denise, thank you for coming on to the Rewilding Podcast.
Thank you very much, Peter, for inviting me and for the nice introduction.
Yeah, I just want to start out kind of asking you about education in human evolution.
Mhm.
And when did cultural transmission through education begin in our evolution? How do we know? And yeah, for example, like what evidence is there for that?
Mhm. Well, maybe it's first good to define what we
Mm,
mean by education
mm-hmm,
in evolutionary anthropology, which
mm-hmm,
is my field of study. So when we talk about education, we often mean in this field transmission of skills, knowledge, or behavior across generations. And when we have that definition, the transmission of skills and behavior across generations, we actually don't see that only in humans. You know, many
mm-hmm,
other social
mm-hmm,
animals have that as well. For example, chimpanzees use tools. They use tools to dig termites out, for example, and they also pass on that skills to their, young, the other generations.
mm-hmm,
That nature has lots of examples of this. One of my favorite social animals, dolphins, for
mm-hmm,
example, they use sponges to hunt, and this is also a socially transmitted skill in dolphins. So when we consider these examples across many other animal species, then we can say that social learning and cultural transmission is not unique to
Mm,
humans, and it's actually rooted deep in evolutionary
mm,
history. Um, so, but I guess what differs humans, and in evolutionary anthropology, there is this term called cumulative culture and cumulative
mm,
cultural evolution. And that's what many researchers think, although there are some debates on whether we observe cumulative cultural evolution in other
mm,
animals as
mm,
well. But what sets human culture a bit apart from other social animals is that our culture is very cumulative. So it's not only that we transmit knowledge across generations, but the knowledge we transmit, we then are able to combine different types of information, or we can add them, so we can modify them in a way that it accumulates over generations. And this way, over thousands of years, then we end up having quite complex skills, complex products, technology. Like, if you consider smartphones, no one could invent a smartphone just by themselves, right?
mm,
It requires lots of different types of
mm,
information coming together, information that was passed on across generations. So
mm,
that's kind of what separates modern humans from um, that kind of culture we observe in many other
mm,
animals.
mhm. Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. So, is there like any particular type of evidence for cumulative culture, like when it started? Um, I think of there's a book by anthropologist Tim Ingold called Making, and he has a chapter in there about the Acheulean hand axe or Acheulean hand axe. And he has like a theory that I think a lot of people don't necessarily agree with, but it's interesting in terms of like his idea is
Mhm.
that uh, like a robin or a type of bird that just builds the same kind of nest across a whole continent. You can look at a nest and be like, that was made by a robin, but they're not necessarily teaching their babies how to build this specific nest. It's just like the making of the nest comes out of the robin and it looks the same in all these different places. And he has this theory that humans were doing the same kind of a thing with stone tools. Like the earliest stone tools weren't like something that we were teaching our children, but that this form of
Mhm.
making was like emerging from us in a way that didn't
Mhm.
necessarily require this kind of transmission. And I don't know if like people agree with that. It seems kind of like far out because I think most of the time when I read papers on like flint knapping and stuff like that, it's very specific to like this idea that there's teaching happening. So yeah, I don't know what your take is on that,
Mhm.
or if there's like particular evidence that's like more or less definitive, not that anything can really be that far back, and like at what time period do we start to see like obvious accumulative culture that's definitely being transmitted?
Hmm. It's a good question. I don't know if we have a definitive answer
Mm,
on
mm,
this.
mm-hmm,
Um, I mean, in general, like, we say that like kind of modern human emerged 300,000 years ago.
mm-hmm,
Um, and then after that, um, let me think a bit further. So I think one of the most established ideas now about the way humans accumulated knowledge was to do with the population structure of these early, modern humans, and how it was important that interactions between different populations, uh, like the possibility of different groups interacting with each other, how that facilitated cumulative cultural evolution.
mm,
Um, so I think I can't say a specific date, I'm afraid, but
mm,
I think one of the key ingredients for this cultural evolution is the um, is the chance that the chance for different human groups being able to have friendly
Mm,
interactions with
mm,
each other.
mhm,
Uh, because that kind of enables groups which have their own specialized knowledge to transfer this knowledge with other groups who also have their specialized
mm,
knowledge.
mhm,
Then that would give rise to, combining this different knowledge together
mm,
and then
mhm,
building up on that. And some scholars even argued that why Neanderthals were not as successful as
mm,
modern humans was perhaps one of the reasons was because of that. They didn't have this kind of, um, partially connected social network structure that enabled humans to, combine and generate more complex
mhm,
uh, information
mm,
and technology over generations.
mm.
Um,
Yeah, interesting.
I don't know if it answers your question
Yeah, sure.
partly,
Yeah,
perhaps.
partly. I mean, it might be a question that we don't have the answer fully to yet.
Mhm,
Um, so yeah, and you've been studying with hunter-gatherers in the field for a while now. One of the questions I like to ask anthropologists who do field work in this way, what are the ethics involved in doing research directly with hunter-gatherers?
mhm. Yeah, that's a very good question. And you know, it's quite a long process. Even before going to do field work, there is a lot of preparations involved. And one of the main things you have to do as a researcher first is to get ethics permission. So that's kind of the first step, and that's usually done through your main
Hmm.
university. So you need to write down all your research aims, all your methodologies, especially because we are working with humans and we ask people questions, um, we need to have detailed, methods description in our ethics applications, what questions we're asking,
Mm,
whether they're
mhm,
sensitive questions, what group of people we are working with. Are we working with children because they're vulnerable
mm,
people as
mhm,
well? So you first have to go through a rigorous ethics check. And then also, as part of your ethics application, you will need to also demonstrate that whatever country you're planning to work in, because anthropological work usually involves working in countries that the university is not, other
mhm,
countries. So you need to demonstrate that you get research permits from the local authorities in that country, which involves establishing connections with researchers in that country. So, for example, I do research in Congo, Brazzaville, and in Brazzaville there's a big university, and there I established connections with researchers who also helped me obtaining research permits through the Ministry of Science there. So that's kind of the first
mm,
step
mhm,
of fieldwork ethical considerations. But of course, the most important thing is that you need to have consent from the people that you are working with. So there's something called informed consent, which also needs to be within your ethics application, where you have a detailed description of what detailed information of what your aims are and what kind of questions you're planning to ask to people you would like to do the research with. And here it's the challenge of anthropological work is that you usually work with people from very different cultures. And sometimes illiterate people, like in my
mm,
case,
mhm,
the community I work with, they don't read or write. So you have to really consider how you're going to communicate that information across. So we often use posters. We make more like
mm,
illustrations, try to illustrate our
mm,
research purposes. Um, And I also work with local field assistants. So in Congo, where I do field work in northern Congo, um, the community speak a kind of Bantu language called Mbangele. Um, and throughout Congo, you can get by speaking French, although
Mm.
there are
Huh.
many different Bantu languages. Um, so we find Mbangele, Bayaka hunter-gatherers who speak both French and their local language. So I work with them. I've been working with actually the same field assistant since
Mm.
2013, which really
Mm.
helps
Mm-hmm.
because they know how you work.
Yeah.
Nicola, my field
Mm.
assistant. So I first explain what I want to do, and then sometimes the kind of questions you want to ask, they don't work. It's like not translatable.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So I first like discuss it with Nicola, and if we
Mm-hmm.
have other field
Mm-hmm.
assistants from the local community, if you think if you think people would understand if we
Mm-hmm.
ask this
Mm-hmm.
question. And then after that, we sometimes tweak the way we ask. Um, Also, like we also consult them first if it's something culturally appropriate to ask.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There may be
Yeah.
some sensitive issues. So in that sense, it's really key working with local field assistants,
Mm-hmm.
getting the informed consent and getting it across the community. Um, and then once we establish that, also then we can start research, but we also always acknowledge that if people don't want to answer our question or if they want to, not participate,
Mm-hmm.
even after they said, okay, I'm willing to, answer your questions, it's totally fine. Um, so yeah, I don't know if.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about the rigorous ethics involved in academic study versus kind of like the eco-tourist variety of like learning from hunter-gatherers. You know what I mean? Like there's just like a world of difference.
Mhm,
And even then, I think that there are still like bad actors within anthropology that don't necessarily follow the ethics themselves, but that there are these ethical standards there, I think is super important
mhm.
for interacting with these other cultures that are so different from our own. Yeah, and I just deeply appreciate the rigorous ethics around that. So yeah, thank you for explaining that.
No worries. But if anyone wants to like do that kind of research, like if we have like young listeners, for example, it's just to show them that it's a long process. It's not like I want to do field work and I go to the field next month. You
Right.
start preparing usually a year before because
Mhm.
those applications take time because you have to revise your questions often.
Yeah, totally. Um, cool. So what are the main ways that hunter-gatherer children learn from your experience?
Yes, so get to the point, the main point of the our conversation, I guess. Yeah, so it's actually really fascinating. When I went there, my first study topic, my idea was to look at how ecological knowledge is
Mm,
transmitted. I was focusing on plant
mhm,
knowledge. But once you are there, you're really fascinated by children's world because
mm,
they really have their own worlds. They're very autonomous. And they're also very passionate to show you the forest. So,
mm,
like, you get to involve with children just naturally when you
mhm,
start living with the Bayaka community. Um, and that's why I started filming because I'm quite interested in like documenting
mm,
their way
mhm,
of life. So I started filming children's day-to-day lives as well. And I had quite a lot footage in the end. And then my colleagues and I said, okay, we could perhaps use this footage to analyze how children learn, like by different age groups. Um, how kind of learning develops throughout
Mm,
hunter-gatherer children's childhood. And then we also had some data on what we call time allocation. So you have systematic observations of people in the camp. Each hour, you record what everyone is doing. And then you have quite a good data
mm,
set looking at like how children spend their time in the
hmm
camp.
hmm
Um, so by combining these different data sets, so we analyze hours of video footage, we look at who children interact with and what they're doing when they're, for example, out in the forest digging yams.
mm,
If there is an infant, who does that in who that
mm,
infant interacts with. And what we find is that in early childhood, so infants, say, even like really young, like breastfeeding babies, they first learn through observing because they are part of the life. They are often carried on the backs of often other children,
mm,
if not
mm,
mothers.
mhm,
And when they are being carried, they of course have lots of opportunity to observe everyone around them. Um, and then once children start walking, they start practicing skills as well. So they start practicing quite early on um, and imitating. So in early childhood, I think the most prominent social learning mechanisms we observed was observing, imitating what others are doing, and then practicing,
mm,
which
mm.
I guess is not very surprising to those people who
Sure.
have
Yeah.
young children, you
Yeah.
know, we all know that how good
hmm
human children are at imitating
hmm
others. Um, and then once children are weaned, most learning occurs in playgroups.
mm,
And those playgroups are often child-only playgroups. And most learning occur through again practice. There is not the distinction between play and practice is quite blurred, you know,
mm,
like they learn they you may observe lots of children going out fishing in swamp forests. Um, and then at one point they're like digging with machetes to find like fish nests.
mm,
But then at another they start like playing around, you know, they start splashing water. And so it's like play and practice is
mm,
quite mixed.
mhm,
Um, and yeah, and then there's I think one of the key um aspects of hunter-gatherer children's learning is the importance of peer learning. Um, that's we can talk about it a bit more. That if you're interested in
mhm.
if you're interested in
Totally.
differences in education, is that I
Yeah.
think that's one of the main difference that we observe that we don't use as much, I think, in our education, like Western education,
hmm
that we don't leverage that
hmm
learn child-to-child learning. We see that in our observations in the videos, and also other researchers from the same field observed that actually child-to-child teaching is much more frequent than adult-to-child teaching.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, these are the main findings
hmm
I can
Yeah, it makes
remember.
me think of, the having older siblings, and learning like stuff that kids my age didn't know who didn't have older siblings, bad word, everything from like bad words to like Santa Claus doesn't exist or whatever, and then I'm telling other kids in my, that don't have those older siblings or whatever. Um, yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
we have a
Yeah.
homeschool program here at Rewild Portland, my nonprofit, and it's all mixed ages for children, so that
Mhm.
specifically because we want them to have that kind of peer-to-peer development.
Yeah,
And
I
then
think that's yeah, I wanted to learn a bit more about your projects as well. And I think that's really important, mixed age child groups.
yeah, years ago I read a book called The Underground History of American Education, which I don't know how much verifiable information is in it, but then Tyson Yunkaporta in his book Sand Talk kind of also alluded to these things where when the Prussian education system was created, one of the things they did intentionally was separate children by age to minimize that peer-to-peer learning as a way of like slowing the
Mhm.
learning down so they could create these like factory workers or whatever, like they studied and they were like, this will actually work well to like keep people uneducated if we just separate them. I don't know how like true that is because I've never delved into that other than those two books, but I wouldn't doubt it in terms of like how, the modern contemporary education is structured versus a lot of these other more free form, societies where that peer-to-peer learning is happening. But anyway.
Yeah, I don't know that kind of like more recent history. My like evolutionary anthropology is quite
Mm-hmm.
going far back in history, so I'm not very knowledgeable on that more recent history of education.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess if we're thinking of differences and similarities, one thing I wanted to also emphasize is that one of the findings from that research looking at videos of hunter-gatherer children was that children use different forms of learning for different domains of knowledge. So, for example, for things like using a machete, and that can also be an example of your tool, like the tool use
Mm-hmm.
examples that you were talking about. Um, it's it's more transparent skill because you can just observe someone using the machete, and then you can easily copy just by observing. You don't necessarily need verbal instructions to convey, to pass that information on. Whereas what we observe is that for information like social norms, for example. So
Mm-hmm.
in the Bayaka community, um, they hunt wild game like antelopes, and when a hunter brings game in the camp, that needs to be shared. There is this norm of sharing. And there are specific rules on how that meat needs to be cut and what part of the meat needs to be shared with whom, and how, like what part of the meat the hunter himself can have. And to convey that kind of more abstract information, you need some kind of directions.
Mm-hmm.
So in one episode of Observations, what we see is that there was a teenage boy bringing a hunted meat in the camp, and then lots of other children came and some adults came as well to get their share of the meat. And everyone was shouting and, give me some, give me some. And then there was one adult present there, and she was kind of instructing him on like how to like this part needs to go to this kind of
Mm-hmm.
more involved, what we can say teaching, what we can
Mm-hmm.
refer to as teaching, more active teaching. Um, so, in the literature, there was a debate on whether these communities have that kind of active teaching. Some anthropologists argued in the past that no, you don't really necessarily see that kind of direct instructions and that kind of teaching that we see in like more,
Mm-hmm.
schooling systems. But although they are not as common as like practice-based learning, but we still see that kind of teaching happens. It's often more like feedback based. So instead of directly saying do this, do that, the teacher, whoever, it could be another child, as I said, the
Mm-hmm.
teacher usually comments on the performance. So like if the child is not giving to that particular person, they may say, oh, give that to that person as well. So it's more like negative, positive feedback
Mm-hmm.
mechanism. But what I'm getting at as well is that, you know, our behaviors is not set in stone neither. So depending on the context and the type of information, we may need different types of learning mechanisms. And because of the way that people live in, more kind of labor skills are very important for foraging. But the kind of skills that we have in like Western societies, it may be really different, especially like
Totally.
if we're talking about maths or physics, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
abstract information. And that does require some kind of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I think a system like more like schooling system where there is a teacher who are like giving direct instruction, that may be necessary at the
Mm-hmm.
beginning at least to
Mm-hmm.
convey that kind of more abstract information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I like the machete example because, as a outdoor program, we give knives to 5-year-olds, and but it's a thing where we definitely are sitting them down, and it's a very controlled environment. We have like a knife yard that, has a rope around it. You have to ask permission to enter it. The knives all have sheaths that they have to be, there's very specific things that they have to do. Um, and they still, end up cutting themselves occasionally. And these are smaller knives, but they're sharp. They could go right to the bone. And we've had kids do that where
Mhm.
one time actually it was pretty cool. There was an older kid who cut himself, and I got the first aid kit out, and I was like, "Hey, do you mind if I call all of the other children over to watch me bandage you up?" And he was like, sure, okay." And I was like, "All right." He almost fainted, so I had him sit down on the ground. But then I called everybody over, and I was like, "I'd like you to see, like watch me how I make the bleeding stop and how I'm going to bandage this." And that, like, he's not crying. It's painful, and he's kind of like woozy, but like everything will be fine. This is just what happens if you get cut. Just sort of like doing these things where it's sort of like demonstrating. So there's observation happening there, but then I'm also kind of like talking about what I'm doing. So there's also some didactic, explanatory, teaching happening. Um, but when I think about a machete, like I watched the videos that you have, on your YouTube channel of these like 5-year-olds, and it's not just these little carving knives like what we use. They're like full on machetes, and I'm just like, wow. And they're using them like effortlessly, like they're very safe with them. You can tell that they like know what they're doing when they're wielding them. And I'm sure accidents still happen in those communities, but it's just like one of those, like, how would I think most parents in like the United States, at least, that are very like helicopter parents that are afraid of everything, it would like blow their minds to see these like kids just like confidently wielding a machete at 5 years old in the jungle. Did you see any kind of like safety explanatory anything, or is it like pure observation by the time they're old enough to hold one, they just know how to avoid injury?
No, like there's no like kind of safety regulations in the sense
Yeah,
that we are
yeah.
obsessed about
Yeah,
in
right.
like in our countries. But that's a very good question. It's something actually I want to observe in the future, like get some like more systematic data if I can.
Mm-hmm.
But from my observations when I was in the field, surprisingly, I'm sure they happen, but surprisingly, I haven't observed any kid cutting their fingers or like
Mm-hmm.
injuring themselves with
Mm-hmm.
knife or a machete. Um, what I observed though, like if a baby, like really young baby, is playing with a knife, there was a very young baby playing with a knife. It's not like they just immediately take the knife. The
Mm-hmm.
baby plays and plays. I guess the people are more concerned that they're messing up with the whatever is there, like the meat or something. So they like sometimes snatch, take the knife off the infant's
Mm-hmm.
hand. Uh, I mean, they may also have really like, okay, this is too much now.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, I think again, the one of the key differences as well is how ch babies are involved in day-to-day activities. And again, because of the kind of social structures we live in, it's not that possible. The type of most people's work that we do, it's not like, and also the culture around children. It's not like you take your child with you into the office, so they grow up by observing what you're doing. And
Mhm.
even if they grow up observing what you're doing, in my case, for example, my child would be observing me sitting down in front of the
Yeah, right, exactly.
computer
Yeah.
all day.
Yeah.
But even then, I think we can give more opportunities to children to involve in our work, which can get really messy. So like, I have a 2-year-old and I try to involve him as much as I can when I'm cooking something.
Mm-hmm.
I give him like blunt, like not very sharp knives. Um, I can't go full Bayaka, like because it's very different lifestyle,
Totally.
the
Yeah.
social structure, the culture is
Totally.
so different.
Yes.
But still, I try to, involve him as much as I can in my day-to-day
Mm-hmm.
tasks, which he also enjoys doing, like,
Mm-hmm.
like doing, like putting things in the laundry.
Mm-hmm.
Although he's very messy, and
Mm-hmm.
that's also something I think we struggle a lot, the concept of time. Everything is so focused on being efficient, and like we have such small times always. It can be people can get really tired if they want to involve
Mm-hmm.
their children, especially young infants, because it requires you to be really patient.
Mm-hmm.
And Bayaka are patient, and it's also like they live outdoors, right? They live in very small huts, but if the child messes around, like there's a lot of opportunities for messy, what we call messy
Mm-hmm.
play, because it's outdoors anyway. Um, so it's not like they're concerned with, oh, it's gonna
Mm-hmm.
make a big mess
Mm-hmm.
in the house, so we can't allow the child to explore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, but we can, like, as I said, I try as a mother, I try to involve as much as possible
Mm-hmm.
in my like more day-to-day life. I guess that's the one only, like, that's a small thing I could do
Mm-hmm.
perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It makes me think too, just in terms of the challenges that we face in, you know, in the majority of societies these days of just the lack of alloparenting. I think
Hmm.
I read Mothers and Others by Sarah Hardy
Hmm.
last year, and it kind of blew my mind just thinking about the amount of help that people got and get in more traditional societies where um, you're just working together. I mean, I think that's one of the other cool things about the peer-to-peer learning. And in your research, I saw too, you had like the time statistics of like how much different groups of age groups were like spending with each other and stuff like that, or different family members, and that cool like graph of the network with all of the lines like connecting or whatever, Um, and it was just impressive to think about how like trusting parents are to just let their kids kind of go hang out with other kids without adult supervision, and how foreign that is to us now today. I mean, even in our homeschool program, part of the thing that we do is we're outside the whole day. So they're all through all of the seasons. So they're experiencing all of the like temperature fluctuations, just different weather patterns, all of those things. But at the same time, there's still like this watchful eye of the adult. And part of that is we're just like, we have to be there for their safety. We're in public parks. There's like stranger danger. There's like garbage, rusty old knives or dirty diapers in the bushes. Like there's just gross things that exist everywhere. And also, we're not this tight-knit community where we trust everybody across the board in this particular way. So we are there to provide like safety, um, first aid in terms of that, and then also like try to do skills and things together where we're like foraging for plants together. And as adults, we're just like like our teachers role model these different things, and then if the kids want to join in on them, they can or they don't have to. But like part of me is like there's this like Western teacher side of me that's like, no, I need to like these kids need to learn these things or whatever, like I want them to come out of this program knowing how to use a knife, whether they want to or not, right? Like there's still part of me that really wants to sort of like make sure they're learning things. And so I'm, trying to like inspire them to want to do it through like storytelling or role modeling or peer-to-peer influence, like try to find the kid that people want to mimic and then inspire them to do like there's just all this sort of stuff that's kind of happening behind the scenes. But even then it's like it's this weird agenda that I have to teach these kids this specific thing. Part of it is like the benchmark of like parents paying for a program, and thinking that they need to um that they need this sort of didactic thing and not understanding like all of the other kinds of learning that are happening in that environment that aren't what we're like set out to teaching, you know? Um, like at one point there was a girl whose parents pulled her out of the program and they were like, "Yeah, we think she just needs to spend more time learning." And I was like, "What?" You know, I was just like, "What do you mean?" Like, and it's so hard to like put benchmarks on what children learn when they're in these environments that are just like beyond quantification or you know. So I don't know. I'm just I'm rambling now about this. So I
Yeah,
guess anyway, yeah. What what do you think about that?
yeah, I guess like I mean you raised quite a few important, interesting points. I think one thing is the intrinsic motivation for learning, and sometimes I feel like we kill it by making it to, like you have to, like learning is um not something part of life, it's just it's like eating,
Hmm.
drinking,
Hmm.
it's part of life, learning. But we make it so much performance based. And this is because of, again, this kind of social structure we live in,
Hmm.
um, that it becomes something else. It's not just for the joy of learning, but it becomes a performance activity,
Hmm.
which is very different from the kind of how hunter-gatherer children learn. Um, Also, the other thing is that they need to learn these skills in the hunter-gatherer community. It's not like um, someone tells them you have to do this to get to here, but it's just like they know that in order to survive, in order to get food, they need to be able
Hmm.
to find their way in the forest. They need to be
Hmm.
able to find tubers, they need to be able to hunt. So it's part of the survival. Whereas perhaps sometimes it's not very clear in in the Western schooling system why children are learning something to children, and that kind of makes it that kind of kills motivation a bit,
Totally.
right? Why am I learning this
Hmm.
now, right?
Hmm.
Um, so that intrinsic motivation, I think, is really important
Hmm.
to make learning just part of the
Hmm.
part of life. Um, and then what else? Oh yeah, alloparenting. I can talk a little bit more about
Cool.
alloparenting. So
Yeah.
what we mean by uh, alloparenting is childcare by not only father and mother, but other community members as well. Um, and my colleague Nikhil Chaudhary so we did most of field works together over years in Congo. And one of his main work was doing really systematic observations of infants. So each day, for example, he would follow um, an infant and he would record uh, every minute, like 30 seconds, he would make an observations and then 20 seconds he would record what has happened. And he did this very systematically for like 6 hours every day. So he had this detailed data of how many children? I can't remember, maybe around 20 children, maybe more. Uh, Children age 0 to 4. So we could look at who took care of children apart from the mother. So in the literature, they are called allo mothers. Um, and then what we see from that research is that on average, there is around 14 people present around a given a focal infant. So that's like kind of the mean social network of an infant. So apart from a mother, say 13 other people, not necessarily giving really like, involved care, but within 3 meters so that if something dangerous is happening, they can interfere still. And
It's
as I
amazing.
said, yeah, and And one of the key differences is the family structures. You know, with the demographic transition, we have fewer children now. That means that children have fewer siblings, as
Mhm.
you mentioned.
Mhm.
Whereas Bayaka children often have many siblings,
Mhm.
although I must acknowledge that child mortality, infant mortality is very high.
Mhm.
So many breastfeeding babies die
Mhm.
before they reach age 4 because of very um, infectious diseases like diarrhea or respiratory problems.
Mhm.
Um, but most children have many siblings. And what we observe from who are taking care of children most of the time is again what we find is that it's the other children, not like after mothers. More than 50% of children's interactions are with other children, not their fathers, not their grandparents, it's with other children. Um, so children play a very important role in both ch transmitting culture, but also in helping caregivers like parents to look after younger infants.
Mhm. I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Rewilding Podcast. I wanted to pause and make a request for your support. With so much media filled with misinformation and outright lies these days, small independent outlets like mine are some of the only ones left striving for brave, truthful inquiry. I need your support to continue bringing you thoughtful, hopeful discourse on human resilience. Please become a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Thanks for keeping my project going. The world needs this.
Um, and one aspect of this also, now I'm working on an article for the anthropology magazine Sapiens.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you know it's an
Mm-hmm.
online
Mm-hmm.
magazine. So I'm working on an article about learning to parent,
Mm.
also kind of giving some personal anecdotes about what I
Mm.
encountered when I
Nice. Yeah.
became the first time mother. Um, and I think the key difference is that because children are so involved in taking care of younger children and like learning, like teaching them, they also in this way learn parenting from very early age.
Mm-hmm.
So when they become parents by themselves, it doesn't come as a
Mm-hmm.
surprise.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in my own case, I was raised as an only child, so my interactions with infants were very limited when I had my son. So it was really shocking for me. Some
Mm-hmm.
like breastfeeding was really challenging. So I also mention in this article that I'm writing that one of the aspects is breastfeeding, and we observed teenage girls putting babies on their breasts, although they don't have
Mm-hmm.
their own milk.
Mm-hmm.
It's just to soothe the baby,
Mm-hmm.
but it's
Mm-hmm.
also a practice for them
Totally. Yeah.
for breastfeeding. So there are two sides. One is like
Yeah.
that children are transmitting knowledge, but at the same time, older children are also learning how to parent while they're
Mm-hmm.
interacting with the
Mm-hmm.
younger ones.
Yeah, that's awesome. It makes me think of two questions. One I forgot. So the other one, the main one is, um, so when I think of children teaching each other and they're spending a lot of time away from like their parents and stuff like that, there's the classic book, The Lord of the Flies, which is like this
Mm,
idea that, without supervision or authority, like
mhm.
people, children in particular, will like go crazy and fight each other and like all this kind of stuff, which I know isn't true. But what is your experience like witnessing conflict among
Mhm.
children as they play outside of the purview of the adults?
Yeah, there, of course, I saw fighting children and making each other cry. And sometimes in those occasions, adults in the camp, if it's happening in the camp, for example, they interfere, they shout at children, they scold children. It's not like they're completely doing their
Mhm.
own stuff.
Mhm.
There is some kind of that kind of reinforcing norms, like,
Mhm.
um, so it happens. But I think again the main difference perhaps why like the Lord of the Flies kind of setting is the experience of children being with younger ones. I think in our societies, there is not such ex so much opportunity for such it's responsibility
Hmm.
taking as well,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, and if you don't have so much opportunity, and if you suddenly leave a 2-year-old with a 5-year-old, I mean, you can't just expect 5-year-old to behave like really,
Right.
caringly, You have
Hmm.
they need to be doing this. They need to be observing other children, how they're interacting with the younger children and learning. So it's a really long process.
Hmm.
Um, and you can't uh, uh, just expect again, like the example that you were talking about, like providing knives to
Hmm.
children. You can't just expect children to start using a tool that they've never practiced in
Hmm.
their life
Hmm.
before. And in the sense, it's the same thing, I think, with looking after other kids or, interacting in a way that it's not always conflicting. But I think here also it's very important to again emphasize the age differences. It's not like 2-year-olds all together, which, as many
Sure.
of you know,
Yeah.
not a very
Yeah.
good story. But
Yeah.
there are different age groups.
Mhm.
And like, for example, when I follow children when they go fishing, it's usually from quite young babies who are just learning how to walk. So they are
Mhm.
often carried by their older siblings up to age like 12, 13. Often adolescents, they go on to their own like trips in the forest sometimes. So we are talking about like quite a wide age range. And then by the time a child is like in middle childhood, like 10, 11, they already act like adults, in this
Mhm.
society.
Mhm.
So it's really important that I think to mention that.
Yeah. That's awesome. I remembered my other question, which is something that I think about a lot, which is the infant mortality. Um, I think to a lot of people in Western cultures where maybe our infant mortality has dropped because of modern medicine, but obviously not in like a lot of the countries where there isn't affluence. Um, but I'm curious, if it's normal in those societies, in a sense, to have this higher infant mortality rate, are there like cultural customs around or some sort of like perception around how they deal with the grief of losing a child in that way? Or is there a setup that like I think I remember hearing in certain societies they don't give children a name until they're like 2 years old because there's some sort of like attachment thing that it comes with a name. And I'm curious
Mm,
if there's anything like that that you've seen that like would help people in a society where that's normal to like grieve in a way where it doesn't feel like it would be affected in the societies where there isn't a higher more. I don't know if that question makes sense,
mm.
but
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. That's something I've been thinking a lot. It's not something, unfortunately, I've
hmm,
really, um, paid so much attention.
hmm,
Like, Um, I guess also because it's not often, we are there in each camp. We sometimes stay for a month, sometimes like 3 weeks, but it just depends on that time frame, what's happening around that
totally.
time frame.
Yeah,
So you don't, although like child mortality is really high, you don't really always witness
totally.
a
Yeah,
death,
yeah.
which then like um, which then like results in maybe you
Hmm.
don't have any more much uh, observations on
Hmm.
this.
And it
Um,
seems like it might also be one of those subjects that's like really challenging to broach as a outsider, just
yeah.
death in general, but like that kind of a question, it seems like, or observations would be hard to kind of really get it unless you were there for a long period of time, built a lot of trust, and then like
Mhm,
knew the norms of it.
mhm.
Anyway, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, like for this kind of research, I wouldn't start by asking questions. I think it's best if you can just observe how
yeah,
people
yeah.
uh, I've I've stayed in pla camps where like a woman, for example, lost their husband, and there's different set of there are different cultural like norms around than how the woman
Mm,
should behave, the grief
mhm,
periods, which
mhm,
involves refraining from many animal foods. So
mm,
the woman only at that period eats mostly like plant-based
mm,
food.
mm,
So that kind of practices, but dealing actually with the death of young infants, I haven't um, really observed in any camp. Um, I mean, there was one actually occasion in so the Bayaka. I didn't give much information actually the kind of setting they live in. So the Bayaka live in the northern rainforests of Congo, um, and traditionally the group sizes are 40, 60 people, but not everyone live in the forest. These days, most of the time there are logging companies in the Congo, and these companies often cut forests by making like like logging roads, like dirt roads, kind of like very narrow no roads. And most Bayaka choose to live around these roads so that they can engage with trade opportunities. So they trade with Bantu farmers, they buy some agricultural products, they buy
mhm,
alcohol, cigarettes,
mhm,
and then they sell hunted meat and
mm,
wild forest
mhm,
leaves. But then there are some hunter-gatherers who choose to live closer to Bantu villages or like logging. There's a logging town where we do field work, and there's a large Bayaka settlement there.
mm,
And Bayaka who live there, they engage in more wage labor. They
mm, mhm,
still go to forests to gather food,
mhm,
wild food, but they also, work in farmers' fields. So there was one occasion when I was in such a place that there was a Bayaka woman with a really um, small infant, and the infant was quite thin. Um, and a few days later, when I went there, she wasn't carrying her
mhm,
baby, and I asked what happened, and she's like, yeah, the baby died. But in that occasion, her husband, the partner, wasn't with her, and she already had a few children. Um, so what I'm getting at is that it also, of course, depends on
mhm.
the kind of social support the women
Totally.
have, and
Yeah.
especially if the partners, if the father absence may play a role in
Mm, mm,
infant
mm,
mortality, and that sometimes, women may feel quite, um, you know, how to say, like desperate in
mm,
those situations that they
mm,
can't even like feed themselves, let
mhm.
alone the other
Right.
children.
Yeah.
So they, in that sense, it's almost like they kind of. I felt like in her response, I felt like she already prepared herself that
Mhm.
that was
Mhm.
perhaps gonna happen.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and the other thing I've been thinking a lot lately that I didn't do, as I said, I didn't do really delve
Mm,
into that,
mhm,
but
mhm,
thinking lately is that uh, death, like the presence of death, and how it's a taboo in our lives, whereas in those societies and in many other traditional communities, that is such a big part of life that how you deal with that is also very different.
mhm. Totally.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Weird.
Um, I had, it's funny when I read Mothers and Others, it seemed like the dads just kind of don't really do anything. And then when I looked at your statistics, it seemed the same, backed up the same thing that she was talking about. Although I know that her Sarah Hardy's new book is called Father Time.
Father Time, yeah.
I have a copy of it, but I haven't started it yet, other than kind of reading a little bit in the introduction. So I'm curious, like, what do the dads do? Like, what are they
La,
doing with their time?
it's actually not true that dads are not involved in Bayaka.
Yeah, okay.
They are involved quite substantially.
Mhm,
So what when we look at the composition of caregivers for infants 0 to 4, after siblings, that fathers
mhm,
play the
mhm,
most
mhm,
role, and then that's followed by grandmothers.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and also, like if you read ethnographies of Barry Hewlett, who worked with the Aka community in Central
mhm,
Africa,
mhm,
one of the main um, kind of themes in his research is the involvement of fathers in the Aka community. So, like Bayaka fathers
mhm,
also involved in caregiving, but not as much as
mhm,
children, like the involvement as children
mhm,
that we
mhm,
observe. So it's a kind of relatively
mhm,
small compared to
mhm,
children, but then it's still relatively big compared to any other
mhm,
caregivers.
mhm, mhm,
But what we also, I think it's important to acknowledge here is that father is just one individual, right?
mhm,
Whereas children are a lot.
mhm,
And also, interestingly, we also, when we look at the involvement of unrelated
mhm,
people in the camp, what we find is that together their their contribution to child care is also quite substantial. So what we see here is that the numbers are important. So even if one child is not providing that much direct care, even if that child just like maybe carries for 2 minutes the infant, but because there are many people like many other children
mhm,
on aggregate, like when their contributions summed up, they actually play a substantial part overall in childcare, whereas the grandmothers or fathers are only one individual.
mhm,
So
mhm, mhm,
um, relatively, they involve a lot, but then on aggregate, when you look at
mhm,
several of
mhm,
these people who are doing little
mhm.
contributions, they add up.
That makes sense. Yeah, it makes me feel better. Yeah.
I don't know, or worse, because in the like kind of more nuclear family structure, it's that's where we lose because we don't
Totally.
have those numbers, and
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
like it gets really,
Hmm.
tiring.
Yeah, I can imagine. Um, yeah, so I have a couple of other questions. Um, do you see negative impacts of compulsory schooling in relation to, or again, versus hunter-gatherer education? For example, like mental health, creativity, things like that.
That's a very good question. I don't have a, robust research on I haven't
Mhm,
written an
mhm,
article on it. I could only speak uh, with my observations
mhm,
being a university lecturer as
mhm,
well. In the UK, I don't know how it is in different countries, but we have a big challenge of mental health like rise
mhm,
in mental health
mhm,
problems in our students. Um, there's like more and more students now needing to be referred to the well-being services. And I think uh, most of the time it boils down to performance anxiety because
mhm,
of the way we grade we
mhm,
need to like even if as an academic, in our meetings with my colleagues, everyone talks about it. Everyone knows that they don't, everyone knows that learning for the sake of learning is the aim. And it's not that we care so much, we care about the grade,
mhm,
but that's kind of the society we live in. So it's really difficult to change um, these settings. And I don't have the answer to that,
mhm,
to like
mhm,
how you can really
mhm,
change it. That's something. I think we are currently discussing
Hmm.
as people in education.
Hmm.
But I do think that that's kind of very much emphasis on performance is
Hmm.
contributing to a lot of anxiety that we see in students. And in the UK, there are some reports like Good Children's Report. Is it,
Mm.
what was it? The Children's Society, or I can't remember the name, but they have really nice, they publish really um, informative reports every year about, and they do that systematically over years. So you can see, for example, how children's satisfaction with their schools have been changing from 2013 to like
Mm. Hmm.
2018.
Hmm.
Um, and when I look at those reports, I see that, yeah, the satisfaction with school um, uh, declines over years. And I think part of the reason is that they don't feel autonomous enough
Hmm.
in their decision making. There's a lot of things imposed on students. So again, like that intrinsic motivation to learn, I think is very important. And when you don't have, you can't have enough of it because of
Hmm.
some
Hmm.
structures, that's when it gets a bit more problematic with like mental health problems.
Totally. Yeah.
With creativity, I don't know. It's a good question that I also was thinking, and at some point was talking with a colleague. It would be great to like kind of do some experimental designs to measure that, but it's.
Hmm.
I mean, there are tests to measure creativity, but most of these are tailored to more for like Western populations.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's quite challenging, when you want to measure something that has like established measurements. That's also the same for mental health. We have
Hmm.
scales like
Hmm.
anxiety scale and stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but how you translate that to in your anthropological work, it's another question that me and my colleagues also have been discussing.
Yeah. Cool. Um, I just thought of another question, which is so, I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time in terms of like how hunter-gatherers raise their children. I think, the first thing I read back in the day when I was a teenager was Gene Liedloff's The Continuum concept, which is like, outdated at this point. There's a lot of, whatever. Anyway, but there's like a new book that came out a couple of years ago called like Hunt, Gather, Parent.
Hmm.
I'm wondering, like, because this is your area of expertise and you're an academic and not a journalist, have you seen anything that's come out of this sort of framework that you're like, this is actually wrong, or this is a misunderstanding? I don't know if you've read any of, those kinds of things, but like the pop culture idea of like, what are hunter gatherers doing that we should do too? Like, I mean, that's essentially what I do. But
Yeah.
but I'm also like, I'm like I try to be a bridge with the academic world that to me is like, the rigorous testing and peer review and stuff like that versus like just what other journalists might be, making a
Hmm.
leap without actual evidence behind it. So I'm curious if you've seen things come up in pop culture around education or hunter-gatherers in that way and been like, what? What is that about?
Yeah, good question. Read some parts of Hunt, Gather, and Parents, and I find some of the information useful because I actually quite like how she tried to make it, um, you know, make that information relevant
Mm, mm,
to
mhm,
like the
mhm,
Western context. Um, we researchers, we try to be very cautious when
mhm,
we, talk about implications.
mhm,
Um, One thing that I really don't want, and sometimes um, I see journalists sometimes make it, people may tend to romanticize, don't know,
mm,
that's
mm,
that way
mhm,
of life, but
mhm,
there are lots of challenges, as I mentioned, like child mortality,
Yes.
infections,
Yes.
neglected tropical diseases that
Mhm.
you see, you can't believe like that they still exist on Earth
Mm.
despite the
Mm.
availability of antibiotics.
Hmm.
Um, so there are aspects that I think can inspire us, but there are other aspects that I think we need to acknowledge that it's not all rosy and they have
Hmm.
really challenging lives.
Hmm.
And that their lives are changing as well, especially with
Hmm.
younger generations.
Hmm.
They, like in any society, they look at other cultures, they're influenced by other cultures, like younger, uh, like Bayaka adolescents, they like, um, going to the town, for example, they want to like purchase goods
Hmm.
from the
Hmm.
markets. They like listening to Bantu music a lot. Like in if there is any radio available in a Bayaka camp, you would see people like especially young
Hmm.
people listening
Hmm.
to new songs like songs in Lingala. So that kind of things they're important to acknowledge. Is that some things are you can't just like say that you're gonna mimic a hunter-gatherer way of life. It's or societies over years have changed so much that you can't, for example, their group sizes are small and they are relatively mobile. So some hunter-gatherer groups are more settled, but some others, like the
Hmm.
Bayakas, still like move their camps depending on the availability of resources. But that kind of social structure also allows for certain kind of political organization. Like if you have an argument with someone, you can just move and go to stay in another camp for a bit. But if you're saying that, oh, we should implement that kind of egalitarian structure now, it's impossible. First, we are sedentary, like we live in settlements and it's huge population. So we need some kind of institutions, established institutions to, maintain the order in the society. So I don't know, people may not agree with me, but I find those kind of more romanticized views uh, misleading.
Hmm.
Also, it's not that they don't have any conflict. There is
Hmm.
always arguments and fights. People shout all the time in the camp. So
Hmm.
it's not like that rosy, oh, everything is
Hmm.
egalitarian, we don't
Hmm.
fight. It's not like that
Hmm.
at all.
Hmm.
Um, but then yeah, I think, as I mentioned, many different aspects that can inspire us, especially in
Hmm.
terms of learning, that's kind of more focused on peer learning, um, trying to establish ways to promote ways um, to reinforce that motivation for learning rather than imposing, rules about
Hmm.
what the lessons should be
Hmm.
like. Um, yeah, those kind of inspirations, I think, is good. And also involving children in your day-to-day life, which in the Hunt, Gather, and Parent book, I think the author does a
Hmm.
good job trying to like suggest ways how to involve the children um, in your lives, in our lives.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, do you have any other thoughts you'd like to share before we end?
Let me see.
Anything you're like, this needs to be said?
Well, I guess I said it in a way in that, but I I'm a bit cautious about, just saying, oh, this is the way we should, you know, learn
Mhm.
because as I said, learning mechanisms adapt to
Mhm.
the context that
Mhm.
the person is in.
Mhm.
And like some skills, like more abstract information, cannot be just merely learned by imitating and observing other
Mhm.
people. So in that sense, I think it's important to say that, our behaviors are flexible and we adapt our behaviors to the environment we live in.
Awesome. This was a really great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the Rewilding podcast.
Thank you for Peter. I also enjoyed speaking with you, and thank you very much for all the interesting questions.
You're welcome. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guest and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my rewild workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. Thank you for listening.